This is the Tree of Life, Season 2, Chapter 7. In this episode, we will be talking about the integration of nonlinearity with linearity through the telescopic effect among lineal lines through lateral alters. Within a lineal line, territoriality is conserved by archetypal assumption, as well as displacement and substitution events within that line. This means that the action of lateral alters is conserved with respect to distinct objects. In other words, as you move up the lineal line, each actor possesses a set of spatial objects of consciousness, which correspond symbolically to the highest spatial objects. Action towards those objects is conserved between lateral alters. This means that analogous actions with regards to separate or distinct objects are taken by lateral alters simultaneously or synchronously. That is to say, there is mirroring between lateral alters in regards to distinct objects. But what if those objects are the same? What if the lateral alters objects of consciousness are the same objects? In other words, if we are not talking about simultaneous action toward separate objects, but rather simultaneous action toward the same objects, we can see that such things are often impossible. Which means that substitution or displacement is a necessary result of such analogous actions. This means that in order for one lineal actor to act, the other lineal actor must be displaced or substituted for. The manner of this displacement depends upon the object of consciousness. If, for example, the reaction is in relation to another person, the induction of expectation matching, or arousal, must be assumed by the lineal individual doing the displacement. Now, what this means is that although typically the objects of consciousness of linearly related individuals are distinct, we all exist within a finite space. Which means, and owing to technology, they can overlap. When this overlap occurs, it necessarily means that the linking of states of arousal created by the joining of a spatial non-consensual actor, an archetypal consensual actor, is exclusive to individual members of each line to the extent of any incompatibility. This means that lineal overlap is eliminated by the displacement of one by the other. What this means is that even amongst lineal individuals with telescopic objects of consciousness, a border exists with respect to specific objects of consciousness within each field which overlap. In other words, even amongst lateral alters segregated in space, there may still be substitution or displacement events pursuant to the same objects of consciousness. In other words, nonlinearity was described as the manifestation of a consensual space just beyond the consensualities of most actors. It involved the expression of every impulse and the acceptance of the consequences of such expression. To fully understand nonlinearity, you must accept that each nodal point, that is each intersection between two individuals, represents the intersection of 9 classes of parallel worlds of intersection. Which is to say, that within those 9 classes of parallel worlds, every individual exists in a lineal relation to every other. Which means in some parallel universe, every person we meet is a lateral alter, a lineal relative, not necessarily because they are different, or we are different, but because both of us are different. This means that if an individual can be calibrated to a particular parallel reality, as the one in which another specific system member is a lateral alter, they can be displaced linearly with respect to their objects of consciousness, within the linear stream. In other words, in a previous episode, we talked about how an intellectual property theft ring is currently being operated to appropriate new ideas and technology from domestic citizens. The manner by which this occurs is through the calibration of the possessor of the idea to a particular universe in which the receiver is a lateral alter. Then, after said calibration, what follows is the displacement and substitution by the receiver of the possessor with respect to those objects of consciousness. In other words, nonlinearity exists as a consequence of a multitude of parallel worlds, wherein we are all linearly related to each other, not distantly, but directly. And the intellectual property theft ring uses this aspect of nonlinearity to appropriate specific targeted objects of consciousness from specific individuals. That's the end of the podcast for today.